Another important feature of Science Bowl are the scientists. So when we talk about the scientists, we're going to talk about some of their discoveries and how that relates back to the content we already covered. And so the first set of scientists we're going to look at, Watson, Crick, Wilkins, and Franklin. So Watson, Crick, Wilkins, and Franklin, you might know, they helped discover the DNA structure. And so the DNA structure, as we know, is a double helix, right? A lot of even like elementary school kids know that nowadays. But back when they were alive and actually Watson's still alive, but back when they were making their discovery, no one really knew what DNA looked like. And it was like a race to try and find out what it looked like. So Wilkins and Franklin, sorry, the L should not be capitalized. Wilkins and Franklin, they got this X-ray crystallography photo that Franklin made that's called photograph 51. And it showed this X-ray crystallography image of DNA. And then Wilkins showed Franklin's work to Watson and Crick. And Watson and Crick were very inspired by Franklin's photo, and they used the information in her photo to come up with the correct hypothesis that DNA is made up of a double helix. And then Watson, Crick, and Wilkins won a Nobel Prize. It's a source of controversy in the scientific community that Franklin did not get a Nobel Prize, even though her work was very, very important. And so this is one point of serious contention in the biological community. So again, these four together, they discovered the DNA structure. Franklin contributed the famous photograph 51 that showed DNA structure, and then Watson and Crick used this to write to discover that DNA had a double helix. Another famous biologist is Charles Darwin. And so Charles Darwin, he wrote a book called On the Origin of Species. And in there he posited this idea of evolution and of natural selection, which are terms you might have heard before. So, you know, like survival of the fittest. So his general hypotheses and axioms are like, you know, animals produce and other organisms, they overproduce. They produce more offspring than what is viable. And some of these offspring will die, but the ones that have better traits, better genes, will survive, and they'll have a higher chance of reproducing. So, and because these genes are heritable, like they can be passed down from generation to generation, over time, all these good genes or these beneficial, like high fitness genes will come to spread throughout the population, and that is how evolution will occur. Gregor Mendel, as we talked about, he is the father of genetics. He was an Austrian monk, and he worked on pea plants. And he discovered and he adopted all these terms, genes, alleles that we use today. Louis Pasteur, he was a French physician and scientist, and he discovered essentially like pathogens like bacteria, just this idea that there were microorganisms that we can't even see them, right? But all around us, there are all sorts of like bacteria and other microorganisms that live with us, and they can cause all sorts of disease, and they can cause like spoiling of milk. So for example, pasteurization, you might have seen on your milk, it says ultra pasteurized. So people, it used to be that because milk is dairy, it can spoil really quickly. But Pasteur found out that if you heat all these beverages to very high temperatures, they kill off all the microorganisms that cause spoilage, and then it can last a lot longer. He also invented lots of vaccines that helped us with curing all sorts of diseases. Robert Hooke was a British scientist. You might have actually heard of him from physics, where he has Hooke's law, which is about springs. But in biology, he's the one who coined the word cell. And so if we look all the way back at the plant cell, it's like kind of rectangular-ish. So when Hooke looked at it through a microscope for the first time and he saw this cell, you know, he looked at it and he thought, these kind of look like these rectangular cells where monks kind of live in, and they do their praying, and so he called it a cell. Because each of these little rectangular units, he thought looked like monk cells. So that's where the name cell comes from. Antonin von Leeuwenhoek, I think, Leeuwenhoek, he was a very famous scientist, and he made lots of really great microscopes as well. And his microscopes are so good, some of the resolutions are even better than what we can produce today. And he lived hundreds of years ago. And he used these really good microscopes to look at all sorts of things. And he discovered all these tiny little organisms, microorganisms again, that were just around all sorts of things. Like he scraped his tooth, you know, there's like plaque on your teeth, and he looked at it and he saw all these like tiny little creatures. He called them animalcules. And he saw that there was like an entire world of microorganisms. And so he's a pioneer in microbiology. Andreas Vesalius, he's a famous pioneer in modern anatomy. And to give a better understanding of his work, we need to talk about his predecessor, whose name is Galen. So Galen is this like Greek guy, and so um, in ancient times they weren't allowed to cut open bodies or do like dissections on humans. So Galen wrote his like anatomy books based off of his experiments with like monkeys, different types of monkeys and pigs, and then he used those experiments of dissections to kind of like hypothesize what the human body looked like. But everyone used those books as if they were human anatomy books, and so for the next 2,000 years, everyone learned from his anatomy books, and it was like all completely incorrect. Essentially, there were a lot of things that are just in the wrong place because they weren't from humans. But Vesalius, he was a professor and a scientist, and then his revolutionary ideas in was to actually do the surgeries himself, dissections himself, and look and see if there's anything wrong with what Galen wrote. And so he wrote a very comprehensive book about human anatomy based off of his own visual experiences, like with dissections of humans. And it's far more accurate than Galen's books. And so Vesalius is like the father of modern anatomy. Okay, and that covers it for our crash course into biology.